weird. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome Anna Bigelow for our Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion talk. I am Karen Barkey, and this is the first conversation in our series of fall lectures. We actually planned to have Anna Bigelow from Stanford University come last semester, but COVID stopped us from that. We wanted to celebrate Anna's coming to Stanford University and joining us on the West Coast to do more work on religious pluralism and cooperate with Berkeley. We have great plans, inshallah, to do more Berkeley and Stanford events. Anna is a long time friend of mine and is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. Her first book, Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India, was published in 2010. The work is on Malerkotla, a Muslim majority town in Hindu-dominated Punjab, and it describes the interreligious relations and the hospitality that happens at the shrine of the 15th century Sufi saint Haidar Sheikh. Since then, she has added the Turkish case to her repertoire with the study especially of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, but also more widely the analysis of religiosity and politics in Turkey. She has published an article on the Hagia Sophia in an edited volume entitled Istanbul, Living with Difference in a Global City. Her piece on the Hagia Sophia demonstrates how the different interests, Islamists in Turkey, Greeks and Byzantine, revivalists in Greece, secularists in Turkey, as three contending forces, each have their own understanding of the building, of its past, of its particular identity. And recently, the comparison of India and Turkey is also part of a new book that she's finishing entitled The Varieties of Secular Experience, Studies in India and Turkey. Today, Anna will talk about, again, India and Turkey, talking about the Hagia Sophia and a Hindu temple that is going to be built on the site of the destroyed mosque in Ayodhya, India. The title of her talk is Where the Nation Prays, Public Religion and Sacred Space in India and Turkey. Anna, welcome, and we are really excited to have you here, and we hope for many years of great cooperation.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to Patty and Rachel and everybody at the center. It's really such a pleasure to be here and such a joy to be on the West Coast. I'll just go ahead and start screen sharing so we can make this work. And there we go. Hopefully that looks correct for you guys. As Karen mentioned, we've been colleagues for a long time and friends who have been able to meet in New York and Paris and in Turkey to work on this question of sharing sacred space and what it means, how it happens, what are the kinds of conditions under which it's possible, and what are the kinds of conditions which make it more difficult. Of course, we're all thinking a lot about how does collective life work in multicultural and diverse populations and places. And so this is a question that I think that we need to all be thinking about, whatever our research sites or the sites that we're inhabiting. So today I'm going to be walking a little bit through some of the structural questions that I've been thinking about as I consider the question of how do people actually be in the same place at the same time, or how do they make it less possible for people to cohabit in the same sacred spaces? So in the wake, well, let's start here. In the wake of the Hagia Sophia's opening as a mosque in July of 2020, Many observers have drawn comparisons between Turkey's assertion of ascendant religious nationalism through the use of sacred space and the breaking ground in August of 2020 for the building of a Hindu temple at the contested site of a destroyed mosque in Ayodhya, India. The rule redefining their constitutional secularism to reflect the conservative religious sensibilities of their leaders and their political bases. In both nations, sites held sacred by multiple communities have been really productive venues for promoting their visions of the nation and mobilizing their constituents to respond accordingly. And so today I want to talk about several key questions that were in the abstract for the talk. Why are sacred sites so central in these public debates about the nature of these ostensibly secular polities? How does the status of shared sacred space relate to the status of religious minorities? Are there particular features of these sites, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and the Babri Masjid Ramjanmabhumi site in Ayodhya, that make them especially significant for religious majoritarian politics? Does the erasure through destruction of the Ayodhya mosque create different possibilities for Hindu nationalist politics than does the more conservative and conservation-oriented approach towards the Hagia Sophia undertaken by Muslim nationalists in Turkey? So it's worth just remembering that both countries as modern nation states were born with massive population shifts, much greater in the case of India, of course, but a much larger population in general in the region, and that these divisions took place along religious lines. These population shifts, of course, were also accompanied by the expropriation of properties, many of which were religious. And then the status of those sites in the aftermath of these population shifts and the births of these new nations has been an ongoing question and problem in both societies. In more recent times, we've seen, though, that the foundational regimes in both India and Turkey both espoused some form of political secularism, constitutional secularism. The late 20th century has seen the rise of religious nationalism. Of course, the roots of both political movements are much older and deeper than these more recent developments, but that's too complicated a story to accomplish in the time that we have today. So the message of both forms of political religion that we see emerging is predicated, at least in part, on declension and salvation narratives. In this view, our society, our way of life, our pride and dignity are in decline and under attack. Only political revolution, accompanied by spiritual revolution, can reverse this process, restore our nation, and pave the way for a future in which politics and the state are operating in the service of majoritarian values. So one way of simultaneously demonstrating and redressing this embattlement is through the liberation, quote unquote, liberation of sacred spaces that are portrayed as misused or occupied by religious others. The Babri Masjid, Ramjanmabhumi, and the Hagia Sophia have been consistently and incrementally mobilized over time as focal points for rituals of majoritarian grievance that bolster and reinforce the multi-layered arguments being made for the proper interpretation and use of these spaces. Whether under attack from internal or external enemies, or both, these campaigns are framed as defensive, essential, and existential. So why? Why are monuments so central in this process of claiming a national identity? Monumental spaces are not merely stages upon which sovereign power is performed. As Sally Promy has argued, the things towards which we orient ourselves shape our perceptions of the environments we inhabit and the possibilities available to us. And though while monuments may offer some glimpse of the original intent that they're present at the moment of creation, they also shape and are shaped by the social systems that continually produce, inherit, reconfigure, and control them. As the phenomenologist of space Henri Lefebvre explained, there's a kind of power feedback loop between monuments and the regimes in which they are created and claimed. He says each monumental space becomes the metaphorical and quasi-metaphysical underpinning of a society. The authority of the sacred and the sacred aspect of authority are transferred back and forth, mutually reinforcing one another in the process, end quote. So controlling the meaning of a monument is an always unfolding and somewhat incomplete process, even in cases of destruction or total renovation. There's a kind of spectral presence, an absent heritage, it's sometimes called, or an imaginal monument may still remain. But the effort to control, it remains a central project in these nationalist discourses. And it takes a lot of work to claim a contested monument. The arguments in both cases, again, have been built incrementally. Religio-political agents in both India and Turkey have tested the proverbial waters in various ways, performing pilgrimages to the site, staging prayers at these sites, having spectacular events such as when a number of pilgrims going to Ayodhya ended up in a situation where the train car in which they were riding was burned, resulting in inter-religious riots in the aftermath. The conversion of other church mosques that had become museums back into mosques in Turkey. So all of these are kind of experimental water testing. These are experiments with the popularity and the palatability of these various strategies. These efforts involve use of both judicial and legislative processes, the production of social memory through ritualization and narrativization, countering minority theological claims with majority apologetics, and appealing to pride, patriotism, and populism. So promoting majoritarian worship in these spaces is a way of performing and defining the nation itself by mobilizing and moving bodies, and by exerting efforts to control the interpretive possibilities that are available to the populace. In India, this process is accompanied by systematic efforts to marginalize Muslim Indians and erase them from the history of the nation, an effort that has both violent and nonviolent dimensions. In Turkey, where state-based homogenization efforts have been underway for almost a century, in contrast to India, where it's a more recent phenomenon, and the non-Muslim religious minority is much smaller, state violence is largely directed towards other internal enemies rather than the present-day Christian population, leaving aside the Armenian genocide. Local Christians are not a political or demographic threat, but the real and perceived anti-Christian discrimination continues to undermine multilateral relations between Turkey and various international bodies and states, such as NATO, the UN, the EU, etc. So in turning to the case of Turkey, the Constitution, as it stands, provides for freedom of religion, but it also preserves a very strong assertion of the rights of the Republic to ensure the so-called indivisible integrity of the state. Laicism, or secularism, functionally means total state control of religion. Neither the Turkish nor the Indian forms of secularism are identical to the US version, so it's important to keep in mind for those of you not familiar with these cases. But in all three societies, we have seen in the last decades in particular, a sector of the majority religious community coalescing around perceived grievance, discrimination, and anti-religious policies. These perceptions have been quite productive in terms of mobilizing politically coherent and sustained action from these sectors of society. So one element in the AKP, the ruling political party in Turkey's process of claiming the nation for majoritarian religious politics, is through the redefinition of secularism itself to mean rejecting enmity towards religion. These are my highlights in the slide. It's already possessing here, we can see a kind of grievance-oriented reading of constitutional provisions as having previously been interpreted as anti-religion. They also frame attitudes and practices that disturb pious people as anti-democratic and as acting in contradiction of human rights. This interpretation of the Constitution lays the groundwork for restricting potentially disturbing practices, such as limiting the presence of bars or places that sell liquor in the presence of mosques, protecting religious sensibilities around personal dress, and so forth. That was formerly a large part of the Republican project in the early periods of the Turkish state, or in earlier phases, up to fairly recently, and is changing rapidly under the AKP regime since 2002. So one of the strategies that we're most concerned with today are those that involve sacred space. One of these strategies involves test cases. In Turkey, this has meant the conversion of other church mosques that have became museums in the Republican period into active mosques. So in the Ottoman period, many churches became mosques during the period of conquest. And then in the aftermath of the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, some of them were turned into museums. There's been a recent trend in reversion of this, sometimes officially, sometimes simply de facto. And though there have been domestic and international objections raised following these events, although a curiously subdued such objection raised in a tweet by and a statement from Mike Pompeo, but no official statement from the president himself from the US. So objections are raised. There's been really no substantial negative consequences to the government in these earlier phases. However, as the scholar Pinar Aykaç has argued, the conversions have so-called vandalized the buildings by hastily, unqualified, and even rudimentary restorations that have taken place with extensive reconstructions. And so from the perspective of heritage conservation, there's a major question about what the long-term effects on the structures will be from these conversions. But even before those Hagia Sophias were reverted to mosques, we saw the introduction of a prayer space in 1991 into the structure of the Hagia Sophia. It's a space that's not accessible directly from the museum or into the museum. There is a door, but it's locked most of the time. And, but it's clearly a project that has had a lot of state support. And here you can see the entryway into this part of the structure. This is the road that goes up to the Topkapi Palace. So essentially, this prayer space has been made out of what would have been the passageway through which the Sultan would enter the Hagia Sophia. It's been extensively renovated in recent years. Here you can see the new mihrab and minbar. This is the Imam's office space here, which has on the wall a framed piece of the kiswa, the covering that goes over the Kaaba in Mecca, which is then divided and sent to various dignitaries and allies by the Saudi government at the time of the annual changing of that covering. You can see the amount of attention that's gone into renovating these spaces. Of course, from the perspective of conservation architects, this would be somewhat problematic, the ways in which these updates have occurred with the placing of carpets, obviously also indicating how poorly this area is actually oriented towards the direction of Mecca for the purpose of performing prayers. In this last chamber that leads into this door, leads into the Hagia Sophia, on the ceiling have been repainted versions of 19th century paintings of Mecca and Medina that would have been there during the time of the sultans, and would have essentially amounted to as close as they could get to performing Hajj themselves, as leaving Istanbul or leaving the Turkish territories or the Ottoman territories was really a risk to take with the kinds of family relations that, that the Ottomans had with one another. So in addition to this opening this prayer space within the structure, recent years have also seen the growth in popularity of various public rituals, such as occasional efforts by individuals to pray inside the Hagia Sophia, increasingly spectacular crowds praying outside, especially on the anniversary of the conquest. These are all expressions of majoritarian grievance that also serve to demonstrate the strength and commitment of those desiring the Hagia Sophia to be an active mosque again. There have also been exhibitions of calligraphy, recitations of the Quran, and other religious content, every time drawing condemnation from interested parties who regarded this as a violation of the museum status, and certainly also of the church. For those who are invested in the idea that the building should become a church again, it's even more reprehensible, but certainly most of the investments were framed in terms of how this was violating the mosque nature, the museum nature of the building. Another experiment in the mosqueification prior to the conversion this year came from government officials on various occasions. Not only were laws proposed and occasionally floated on the parliament floor, government officials would occasionally speak out. And we can see here in this longish quote, which I won't read, but give you a little bit of a sense of we can see affective, theological, and legalistic claims all being made by the then Deputy Prime Minister Bülent Arınç in this speech at the opening of a textile museum at the Hagia Sophia complex. In the speech, he argues that the building itself was sad in its current non-mosque state, and that as a nation of laws, Turkey must abide by laws, and that by law, a mosque could not be used for other purposes than as a mosque. It's a somewhat tautological argument, to be sure, but it also very deftly interweaves these multi-layered claims and connects them in the minds of the audience, the target audience. This argument has continued even after the conversion, as Erdogan and the AKP have generated content that to continue presenting their case to audiences both foreign and domestic. The shape of these arguments reveal both their own strategies in authenticating their claims and also their sense of what the most effective and effective counter-arguments that they must also address might be. In his 25-minute speech to the nation, Erdogan used internationalist language of sovereignty that also resonates with majoritarian grievance, the idea that Turkey has every right to do what it wants to do to the properties within its borders, and any suggestion that they shouldn't is impinging on national sovereignty. He also engaged with legalistic language that speaks to both the past and present of the laws of waqf, or religious endowments. And so this, by law, this is the nature of the space. That cannot be altered. Waqfs are endowed in perpetuity, and the change was actually into a museum was actually illegal from that perspective. And so this is actually restoring the natural legal status of the building to what it was from the moment it was changed into a mosque. He used emotive language that drew on the laments of famous poets and artists at the loss of Hagia Sophia, sort of speaking to the deep affection that the entire population has possessed over centuries for the building. And he also used theological language that framed the mosque conversion in soteriological terms. You can look here at the last section on destiny, where he not only evokes the idea that at the conversion, the Ottoman Sultan, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, had made an assertion that anybody who violated the waqf would essentially be cursed on Judgment Day, that this is a great sin, that they should not make any change whatsoever to this waqf, and that their eternal soul was essentially hanging in the balance should they do so. And so therefore, in this frame, the resurrection of Hagia Sophia is the footsteps of the will of Muslims across the world to come out of this period of the interregnum, the period of the Republican Museum. And so this idea of that doing this, bringing this building back into being as a mosque, is righting wrongs together with the hopes of all the world's oppressed, wronged, downtrodden, and exploited. He also linked all of the critiques of this move to Islamophobia and xenophobia, saying, essentially, this is the only reason this is objectionable is because it is a Muslim behavior and it is a Muslim space. This wouldn't be problematic in any other place. Nobody objects to UNESCO World Heritage sites that are also active churches. He evokes Notre Dame in this context frequently. The AKP has also recently published a brochure in both Turkish and English, and possibly other languages I haven't actually checked, which reinforces the messages that Erdogan gave in his speech, and that justifies the conversion on a whole host of fronts. All of these arguments are essentially anticipatory of the scope of global critique of this move, which has come from many directions. So he argues, or the AKP argues in this brochure, that custodianship, since the time that it became a mosque, it's been immaculately cared for, that this is the will of the people. There's a survey with no methodology given that says that 78.6% of Turks wanted the building to be a mosque. And frankly, in my own experiences in talking to visitors at the Hagia Sophia over the years prior to the conversion, many people did in fact say that they wanted this to be a mosque. And that if it would in fact start, and if it did in fact ever revert to Christian control, then Christians would be well within their rights to return it to a church. So that was a common expression of the nature of the space. So it's still too early to see if these actions will have any major effect on the AKP's standing with the Turkish public, given the poor economy in general and other domestic challenges. Some survey data has shown some eroding support for Erdogan, and that this move has not moved any electoral prospects for the party much one way or the other. Nonetheless, having explicitly rejected the authority of internationalist bodies like UNESCO to challenge this, it's unlikely that anything other than an electoral defeat will reverse the situation. Condemnations have rolled in from many directions, including this tepid discouragement from Pompeo on July 1st in anticipation of the change. But Trump, who tweets on everything, has not done so on this issue. Since the AKP argument is predicated in part on their role as custodians of heritage, that they're taking such good care of this place, and therefore they've preserved the elements of the church that were part of the museum as well. The mosaics in particular are among the most famous. Because it's still all here, the building remains open to reinterpretation and redefinition. Unlike in India, where the destruction of the contested site in question not only alters the possible futures, obviously, but it also reveals distinct goals and methods of these two religio-political projects. So as we turn to think about India, we should briefly consider the Constitution, as we did before. The Indian Constitution spells out a lot more specific rights that religious communities, especially minorities, can claim from the state. This form of secularism, in which the government is responsible for ensuring the conservation of minority communities' language, education, and culture, has been state policy, but it has also become a rallying cry for opposition from the critics of this form of secularism. For a long time, Indian secularism has been perceived by its critics as appeasing and offering preferential treatment to minority communities at the expense of the majority, a kind of zero-sum game logic of any kinds of state support. These perceptions have a deep history, as we see in these words from the foundational ideologue V.D. Savarkar in the quotation here, which defines Hindutva or Hinduness as the core principle that binds India together. But it really wasn't until the late 20th century that the Hindu nationalist project of redefining the nation in its own terms has come to political power, and fairly decisively so, as you saw in the earlier slides on the popularity of the BJP in present-day India. In the second quotation from the leader of the most powerful Hindu nationalist organization in India, the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat says that Hindutva is the identity of India, and it has the capacity to swallow other identities. We just need to restore that capacity. Here we see the apotheosis of Hindutva as not only the sense of a common nation, race, and civilization, but also as absorptive assimilationist force that's able to bring all of India into its orbit. Like the AKP, the BJP and its affiliated organizations are also in the business of redefining secularism, claiming the constitutional principle and operationalizing it towards their own ends. Secularism, as historically practiced in India, is portrayed as distorted, political pandering, separatist, and corrosive to a sense of national identity. Hindutva secularism, by implication and assertion, is honest, clear, and productive. Further, as the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has interpreted it, anything positive about secularism actually springs from ancient Indian principles, not from the Constitution and its architects, who were, in some cases, anti-religious, but certainly in all cases, interested in ensuring a peaceful multi-religious polity. So here we see that the principle of equal respect and treatment for all faiths has been a part of India's ethos for thousands of years, and that is how it became integral to the Constitution of India. And of course, the burden of secularism is seen as entirely being borne by Hindus and not by either the government or by Muslims or Christians to a lesser extent. Oops. So the BJP in its annual program, manifesto, where they speak to essentially the party platform, has since the late 80s always included a statement on the importance of building a temple to the god Ram, who is believed to have been born on the site, at the site of the destroyed Babri Masjid, before it was destroyed and after. They've also called for rescinding the 1991 Places of Worship Act, which had actually been intended to ensure that religious spaces could not be converted from one religion to another. They've been successful in rescinding this past year the Article 370, which ensured the special status of Kashmir, a Muslim majority province of India, and changing property ownership rules, which they had believed were preferential towards Muslims, and various other things. So central to their BJP strategies in promoting Hindutva identity has been the entwined concepts of Pitrabhumi, fatherland, and Punyabhumi, holy land, the confluence of national territory and sacred space. Oops. So the long history of the debates over the Babri Masjid or Ramjanmabhumi are too long to go into. Suffice it to say that court battles have predate independence, and the site has essentially been closed to the public since 1955. Successive courts and governments have failed spectacularly at resolving the question of identity and ownership up to this point, and so by the BJP's own account, they're forced to take action. Oops. In a spectacular ritual of grievance, a procession was led by the BJP leader L.K. Advani from the archetypal Somnath shrine in Gujarat to the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya, in UP. So you can see on the map on the right, there's the winding trail is there. Violence followed the path in several cases. Additional ritual engagement included bringing water from sacred rivers all over India and collecting bricks to be used in the construction of the future temple. In fact, most of the temple is already built and essentially staged, ready to be assembled. These experiments then bore fruit when the mosque was overrun by Karseviks or activists on December 6, 1992, destroying the structure and sparking riots and deaths in many regions. In the aftermath of the demolition and riots, the BJP, like other groups, produced an after-action report on the form of a white paper. Throughout this 175-page document, memory and monuments are intertwined with the nation. We also see a theological dismissal of the mosque as anything other than a symbol of conquest. As you see in the first quotation, it was purely and simply a symbol not of devotion and of religion, but of conquest. Secularism is presented as a diminution of Hindus, making national pride shameful and linking it to the pitiful status of Hindu authority at the time. One of my favorite phrases ever, the provocative ocular effect of Muslim monuments and the atrocities of Muslim rulers are woven together here to produce an affective response among the supporters of the temple, who perceive this, that it having been a mosque, as a sign of the kinds of atrocities that the great nation was perpetrated by the Ghaznavis, the Baburs, and Aurangzebs, and of their victories. And so the sense of humiliation that needs to be restored to a new status is being evoked here. There's also further arguments on the assimilative nature of Hindu cultural nationhood, as being the true and appropriate basis for religious harmony going forward. And that the Ayodhya movement characterizes that, is again, linking this notion of Holy Land, Fatherland, and national unity and identity into the same web. So from 1993 to 2020, this provocative ocular effect of the Babri Masjid is no longer present. The November 2019 decision of the Indian Supreme Court has opened the way to the construction of a Ram temple that will, in Modi's words, epitomize our national feeling. You hardly need to analyze these declarations in order to recognize how Modi casts the significance of the site as representative of the nation. This temple will be the emblem of the collective willpower of corps on corps, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. This shrine will inspire belief, devotion, and determination in the minds of future generations. Oops. But this is not the only site that we should remember, that Ayodhya is not the only place that has been targeted for this kind of spectacular conversion. in India today. In addition to this famous sites in Mathura here, the site of the birthplace of Krishna, claimed to be thus. You also see plenty of barbed wire here in this image and gating to protect the site from activism. But there's also been a popular slogan raised at many of the activist rallies that this is just the beginning. Ye to keval jhanki hai, Mathura Kashi baki hai. That still waiting is Mathura here and Kashi or Varanasi here, where similar structures have been. You have the confluence of temples and mosques adjacent or on top of one another's properties. But there are more sites throughout India with layered histories and multiple constituents and owners that are also occasionally useful for political symbolism. And this is another site of my research, which is in the mountains of Karnataka, which has been targeted historically as the Ayodhya or the next Ayodhya by ideologues who want to have this be under Hindu management alone. So to wind up here, and return to our questions that we began with, we have to start to think a little bit here about the questions. So why sacred sites? These sites are not just provocative ocular effects of past episodes of domination, but they're also material and spiritual reminders of more complex and not always conflicted histories of interreligious civic life. Even in the midst of these controversies, Muslim Turks still visit churches and Hindu Indians still visit Muslim shrines to pray for healing and seek spiritual comfort, just as they have for centuries. Local and regional authorities often applaud interreligious comedy at sites like the House of Mary in Ephesus or the tomb shrine of Hazrat Tawakkul Mustan in Bangalore, or in Malerkotla, where I did my dissertation research. But these alternative realities pose challenges to the exclusivist claims forwarded by the AKP and the BJP at the national level and require enormous investments of energy in the ritual and interpretive possibilities available to the population. So making the argument for the mosque or the temple has become tantamount to making an argument for their vision of the nation. Then, on the question of religious minorities, these high-profile sites are indices of minority status, and their treatment serves as messages to minority groups. Legal recourse in both societies is limited or exhausted, and they are increasingly subservient. The legal apparatus, the judiciary, are increasingly subservient to those in power, as are the minorities. Again, though, at more local levels and in grassroots organizing, there's still opportunities for coalition building and change. We've seen this with the Gezi Park protests in Turkey and with anti-CAA activism, protests against a law that was particularly targeted towards Muslims to essentially render them non-citizens, as well as in regional and local elections that tell more complex stories about the true status of these societies, in spite of the popularity of their ruling regimes. So there are numerous features in these particular sites then. What about these sites makes them useful? The Hagia Sophia, of course, was built by an emperor in a moment when his authority was shaken by opposition and riots. It was a visible and material manifestation of the divine right of imperial rule. Only a great power could harness the resources, both material and human, to build such an edifice and to maintain it. So every change in its identity, from church to mosque to museum and mosque again, has been accompanied by a determined multi-layered campaign to establish the legitimacy and authority and to give it purchase amongst the populace. In the case of the Babri Masjid, Ramjanmabhumi site, it's far more ambiguous in its documented history. It actually recedes into the epic past of the Ramayana before recorded history. There's no agreement among archaeologists about the evidence for an ancient Ram temple at the site, let alone whether the god himself was born there. But the trope of the destroyed temple has been a consistently useful, if historically problematic, issue for Hindu activists. And so this destruction of the Babri Masjid created what might be called euphemistically facts on the ground. The option for preserving the mosque as a valued part of India's heritage is simply gone. And the Supreme Court decision has cleared the path for the Bhumi Puja this past summer, the worship, devotion to the earth, and the construction of the temple. For the Hagia Sophia, because the building remains, more possibilities remain. but they are not equally available to the various constituents. In either case, I would suggest that only massive groundswells of popular support and substantive political change could possibly alter the future lives of either of these spaces. So I will wrap up there, and hopefully there may be some questions that we can address.
Hello.
Great.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this wonderful talk with incredible images as well. It was really interesting to watch and to listen to. We have start.
Yeah, I can see a few questions here.
Okay, yeah. I have questions here, and I think...
want me to start somewhere in particular?
Yeah, no, I think if you want to take the questions one at a time, we can read them. Do you want me to read them, or you want to...
I can see them as well, so...
yeah, but for the audience...
Anybody watching can read them as well.
Okay, so then...
Should I read them?
Go ahead and respond to the questions. The first one by Philip Lutgendorf.
Lutgendorf, yes, a very prominent figure in South Asian studies. So the question about what has happened to the exposed mosaics in the Hagia Sophia of the Virgin and Child in the sanctuary, the seraphim in the dome. Have they been covered again? No, not exactly. They have scrims that appear over only those that are in the central structure during prayer times. So they're still available. And this is one of the cases, of course, that the AKP and everyone make for this not being actually a fundamental alteration of the space as a museum, because people, whether just out of curiosity, for appreciation of art, or Christians who want to see this relic of the Byzantine monumental church, they can still see all those things that were there. They are claiming to continue with all of the restorations and renovations as they've been proceeding. And you can actually, see, there are videos that you can see of how the covering occurs at the time of prayer, but it's minimal. And it doesn't include things in the upper galleries or other areas of the structure that you may be familiar with. So it's another interesting point, actually, that even that covering didn't occur until quite late in the Ottoman era. And so the plastering over of the mosaics was not, it's certainly in all cases, a constant from 1453, the time of conquest. It's something that occurred incrementally and really didn't become a major feature until the 18th and 19th centuries. So it was a bit, so I think that also makes us think a little bit about what we mean when we say things like Muslim iconoclasm, because it's a little bit more complex in the way they were actually dealing with the site at the time. But thank you for the question. Let's see, Shekhar Hatangadi has said, just curious to know if the Hagia Sophia contained any historical artifacts to justify being called a museum, or is the building structure itself the artifact? Great question. There have been excavations that show other layers below the Hagia Sophia that existed prior to the structure being built as a church. And actually there were previous churches on the site as well that that collapsed or didn't burn, I think in one case. And so there are ways to consider the site as having this multi-layered history, of course, and then changes have been made that are also of, substantive, both architectural and architectonic, as well as artistic and aesthetic contributions that came during the Ottoman period as well. So there truly is a multi-layered history that both predates the church and goes into the present day. I forget if that was the substance of the question entirely. So does this justify calling the structure itself as an artifact? Well, so that's a really interesting question, and you might get different answers from social scientists and humanists like myself versus from an art or architectural historian or conservation heritage perspective. And so what actually is an artifact and how should it be treated is a major debate and an ongoing one in heritage studies. And so it's a really good question, one that unfortunately I don't have a satisfactory answer to, other than to point out that there certainly are a host of layers. The question does touch on the issue of whether museumification, as it's often called, the idea that we can render cultural heritage somewhat neutral and universally available through the process of making it a museum, that this may in fact obviate the investments in it as a sacred space that can be the most powerful attachments and that then are the most available for political mobilization, as what we're seeing today. That question is also a very open one. Does museumification actually do anything to mitigate that? In the Hagia Sophia case, we can say no. You know, being a museum did not reduce those attachments or its political utility or its sentimental experience for people on all sides who want it to be a church, who want it to be a mosque, or secularists who have sentimental attachments to it as a museum, which is a real thing as well. So it's an interesting question indeed. Rizwan, my old friend Rizwan. So yes, the mosque is a tourist space is his question, or he's just educating us all on something here. Another trope we see in the Turkish discourse is the mosque as tourist space, simultaneously coexisting with the mosque as prayer space. Yes, and then the example of the Blue Mosque or Sultan Ahmet just across the plaza in Istanbul is often cited as an example of this, that sure, it can be a museum at times when it's not a space for prayer. So does the perception of the Hagia Sophia or narrative of it as a site of tourist visitation impacted by this change? How have tourists been understanding this change in status? Are mosques being recast as Muslim-only spaces? It's a little hard to say. Of course, COVID gives us a sort of dim view of tourism at the moment, so we don't have a complete answer. I will say that the state media has been extremely deliberate in its constant reiteration of how many people have come to Hagia Sophia for prayer. Millions of people. One post, 1.5 million have come to Hagia Sophia. So in that sense, it's hard to know whether this will be a part of the discourse. They can't accommodate all the people who want to pray in Hagia Sophia, particularly on Fridays. They're still out in the plaza out front. But even that is part of the sort of spectacle that serves as evidence of the legitimacy of this conversion. I don't anticipate the AKP trying to thwart people from attending. They've made a huge investment in this, for non-Muslims to attend the site. That as a mosque, of course, now it is no longer available for the tourism board, the Ministry of Tourism, which had been partially overseeing it, where they were getting, $10, $20 for every foreign visitor. That with 3 million people traditionally visiting in a year who are paying that, that's a big loss of revenue as the most visited site in all of Turkey historically. So this also shows the level of investment the government has made in making this change, because they were willing to take that hit in very, very bad economic times. I think they're also relying on this possibly having a drawing effect from other potential touristic destinations, particularly from the Gulf and from parts of the Middle East. So looking more towards other tourism away from Europe. So I'm now I'm getting behind on the list of questions. And I see so many familiar names. This is delightful. I'm not sure, Karen, do you have somewhere I should go next here?
Well, the next question is on comparative secularisms. You want to answer
Which one
that?
is this?
What according to Shekhar Hatangadi?
We already answered a question from Shekhar, so I might go.
Okay.
I'll come back if we have time at the end.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a non-academic, fantastic. The neo-pagan regression of these cultures is, I'm not really sure what that is signifying, is not necessarily an interesting phenomena since we've seen the same imperial handbook. Sure. what is interesting is how are these cultural markers related to economic markers that exist in these societies. BJP has used the distraction of religion to privatize quite a lot of the economy. Yes, this is not the focus of my research, but it's absolutely correct that in both societies, the real economy is not only suffering because of the pandemic, as everybody's suffering, but was in pretty poor condition prior to that and is under a lot of duress. So religious issues, of course, provide fantastic distractions and ways to unify political bases in both societies. So that is certainly the case. I mean, and that is certainly the case elsewhere. This is not solely the playbook of India or Turkey, Erdogan or Modi. These are pretty reliable playbooks to, look over there. This is happening. Forget about all that bad stuff over here. So yes, no, absolutely, I would agree with that.
It also, I think, tells you about the temporality, why it happened now. Because Erdogan used to say, if you want to pray, you can go across the street to Sultan Ahmed to the Blue Mosque and pray.
Yeah,
when people wanted that,
right? Yeah.
But now, at this moment of economic downturn, it makes sense to do a big splash, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the timing is perfect for all of those reasons, as well as with Modi. Although in the case of Modi, there's also an astrological perfection of time about why that had to happen then. I was actually surprised that in the Hagia Sophia case that it wasn't, the first prayer wasn't on Conquest Day, which would be May 30th. I don't know if that surprised you as well, Karen. I thought that it seemed like that would have been.
I didn't hear that part, sorry.
To have had the first prayer on May 30th on Conquest Day.
Exactly.
I'm surprised that they didn't do that. July 24th, what is that? Although I guess that's the coup day.
The coup day, and they did actually bringing the sword to the mosque, to Hagia Sophia, is the Conquest Day. They brought the two together in symbolism, I think.
Yes. And also that has historic precedent as well. The sword as a symbol of Sultan's authority. Not purely like a valorization of violence, as I think a lot of people.
No, but a valorization of conquest.
Yes, and of political authority, of sovereignty. So it's all about sovereignty for sure.
Yeah.
Erdogan's used other tactics before, as has Modi, to distract the population from things he doesn't want them to think about. When they lost the June elections in 2015, he's fomented some disputes with the Kurds because the Kurdish party had been one of the biggest problems for them in that election. And 6 months later, they had a new election and brought back Erdogan to a majority. So he's they have a lot of tactics to use. But this is a very powerful one.
Yeah.
So Jem from Stanford is asking, and I've lost it. Okay, about what we think about the issue of debates over sacred space in secular spheres compares to the Park 51 community center debates in New York City, which is a great question. And I think a lot of these questions, the question of what is American sacred space is one I know, Jem, you're interested in, how it's constituted, even if it is memorializing perhaps. So this is the Park 51 Community Center, which was in the Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan, became called the Mosque at Ground Zero by its critics, and developed, created a whole Sturm and Drang about this, a sense of this being a conquest, a mark of a conquest by Muslim communities, which of course, the actual community that was founding this place were the last people who are in any way gloating about the events of September 11th, 2001. But so I think all that as well, though, shows us what constitutes sacrality, what constitutes sacred space, is a really potent pool for mobilization on multiple levels. But it takes work to have them be construed in the way that their interlocutors want them to be understood. So people in that case, like Pamela Geller, for example, was one of the most active interlocutors to try to have that community center be interpreted as a conquest mosque. And she worked very, very hard to make that happen. So I think you can see how she did it through repeated appearances on the news. She has her own YouTube channel where she and people like Robert Spencer speak about all kinds of atrocities that are all attributed to Muslims. So it becomes part of an extant thread of Islamophobic majoritarianism, and the sense that the majority is again being put upon by these minorities and subject to their coddled needs, that they're being appeased by being allowed to do these things, and that this is actually an offense in some way. So it has to be construed as an offense, and that was something that we saw a lot of energy and labor go into, much the way we are seeing the energy and labor going into how these sites are supposed to be interpreted by their populations. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. It would be a fun comparison to flesh out. So Rena is asking about how, that just disappeared, the way Hindu Indians consider or relate to the Taj Mahal, which is a mausoleum, not a museum, not a masjid, not a place of prayer. Has that changed over the same period of time? Interesting. There are sections of the Hindu nationalist world which thinks that the Taj Mahal was also actually originally a temple and was a place that was occupied essentially. And so those attachments are there. It hasn't become a major theme, but it is a percolating one that you can find in Hindu nationalist websites and chat rooms and things like that. I haven't been tracking it to see if that has changed much with the Ram Temple, or whether what I'm expecting is that we'll simply see now, as the construction of the Ram Temple begins, a shift to one of these other most prominent sites, quite likely, either in Mathura or in Varanasi, because those are the ones that have taken up the most space so far. But we'll see. We'll see what happens next. But yeah, it's definitely something. It's a good question to pay attention to as we go forward. Okay, and Vatsal has asked, these keep disappearing as I look at them, the distinction made in the different types of arguments in the Turkish case was very helpful. How does the set of distinctions operate in the Indian case, especially for the shrine in Karnataka? So the types of arguments that are often made in the case of the shrine in Karnataka, they've been both legal and ritual, as well as all of those. That full range has been at play in the Karnataka case, in the shrine in the Coffee Mountains, which is a site that is also duly identified as either a place where a Hindu avatar of Vishnu has appeared, or a place where a Sufi saint had spent his time and eventually also kind of apotheosed. And then his followers subsequently became custodians and were buried there. There's been a long legal battle since the 90s over the status of that site that was recently resolved in the Karnataka High Court in favor of the Muslim custodians, the son of the former custodian who's been suing for his authority. But that district has also been represented by a BJP politician for years, C.T. Ravi, who has made this one of his issues as well. So it remains a very potent question. So the legal cases have persisted about questions of ownership that have looked for history and archaeology to validate or verify particular claims about the nature of the site. There's been annual prayers by both sides. The traditional death day anniversaries of Sufi saints has continued to unfold, sometimes being thwarted by the local government. There have been annual Jayantis, birth days of the saintly figure Dattatreya, who's said to have also spent time there from the Hindu perspective, that involve rituals that have to then purify the space from the previous Muslim practices that have been taking place under the mediation of a Muslim fakir. So there's a ritual vocabulary of contestation, a legalistic one, and all of that. That's certainly taking place in that case as well. And you can see similar parallels in most sites that have those multiple attachments. And I would also say that these are made more, in my perspective, I see that it becomes more problematic or more sharply refined in sites where you don't have two sites next to each other, but you actually have this layering. And so the simultaneity becomes more complicated. I mean, we even see that in, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right, where Christians can't get along with each other sometimes, and you have fisticuffs between monastic communities about whose turn it is to do what in those ritual spaces. So that the question of what is the actual nature of the site is something, of course, Vatsal, you know this very well, and this is something that Karen and some of our friends have been working on for a while, thinking about what are the particular features of spaces that make them more or less conducive to these kinds of arguments. So thanks for that.
We have a
long how we are on time.
I think we should do a couple more questions and then give you, this one is a long one. Oh
my gosh, I see all these familiar names. It's so delightful. So do you have one that you particularly want us to get to? I haven't been able to read ahead, so.
I haven't read ahead. I'm listening to you. I would like actually for you to talk about a little bit more the mainstream media, because that's very interesting in both cases.
Okay.
The question by Rashmi Shetty.
Okay. Shetty.
If you could.
Okay. Rashmi says, can you talk a little bit about the role of mainstream media, traditional media like news channels, and framing narratives in both these cases comparatively? Well, if you watch the coverage of either of these events as it unfolded and much of this is on YouTube, happily nowadays, it makes COVID research a little easier that we can watch these things. It's fascinating watching Modi at the Bhumi Puja or even giving his speech. It's interwoven in some of the networks that showed this. Not only, of course, it has a rolling scroll bar, the Chiron, which tells you how you should be interpreting this, or the things that Modi says, which are often, speaking to the nationalist pride. This idea that this is something that the nation has been crying out for, that this was something that is fulfilling the wishes of millions or crores and crores. And then there will be other pictures of him participating in the puja itself, which then from the sort of the secularist mainstream news, all of these things are immediately called into question, that the legitimacy of the puja, who the pujari, who officiated and how that was done, who was actually on the platform and how that was unfolding, critics of the COVID practices, so there's an interesting dueling interpretations happening about whether that was a legitimate performance or not. And the idea that what should have been a 12-hour puja or worship service to establish this space was actually condensed into half an hour because he's the prime minister. He's not going to sit around for that. Was the critical view, from the perspective of those who supported this or who were essentially our voices of the state. And the media in India is, though not entirely state controlled, a lot of the mainstream media is extremely supportive of BJP agendas, and so that was unproblematic in any way. It was simply a sign of the perspicacity and wisdom of the leader. Erdogan, of course, in Turkey, the media is there's a lot more state outlets that are owned and managed either by the state or by allies. And sometimes other media outlets have been shut down. Turkey has the worst reputation in terms of journalistic freedoms of any country, perhaps except ours, no, not so bad here, comparatively speaking, but people are jailed, news sites are closed down, particularly those that, of course, you're probably all familiar with what happened after the coup attempt, in which, you know, everything associated with the Gulen movement, and they had a large media presence, was eliminated. So media control is a major feature. It's a good one to think about. Where would you like?
Take one more question?
Which one where do you want me to go?
Peter Gottschalk.
Peter.
Yeah.
Oh, another familiar phrase. Thank you. Is it worth, where'd it go? Is it worth creating a new category and term other than sacred for sites such as Hagia Sophia and the Ramjanmabhumi? So specifically nationalists find so affectively important to their orientation of the nation. Sacred would presumably be applied to many or most mosques, churches, and temples. I wish we could have a conversation about this, Peter. We need to have this as a more robust conversation, but it would be used for Jallianwala Bagh. So I guess this kind of goes back to Jem's question also about Part 51, about what constitutes the sacred there, right? Because that wasn't actually meant to be a mosque, and then the question is, per se, I mean, it could be used as a prayer space, but is the site of September 11th, the Twin Towers, is that a sacred space? A lot of Americans would, of course, argue yes. But I think what you're asking us to consider is whether, just because people actually have that perception, is that from a categorical, and I know you're always interested in questions of category and genera, like is sacred actually the right word for this? And I'd like to think with that a little bit, and I wish I could hear what your thoughts are on whether sacred per se is the right word. My tendency would be to say yes. I think that in my reading of how secularism actually functions, and the nature of what is the secular is a very religiously defined concept and practice. So political secularism has its rituals, has its theologies, if you will, and that there's a lot of ways in which we can think of the operations of ostensibly holy spaces as having forms of being sacrosanct, as being offset from other spaces, which of course goes back to foundational theories about what makes sacred space, that it is that which is set aside or that which is set off, the distinction between the sacred and the profane, etc. I think certainly profane equals secular is a very problematic equation that I hope is not being made as much anymore these days as it once was. But your question, I think, means that we all need to be writing and thinking more carefully about that. So it's a great question. Yeah, I appreciate that.
This is a great moment, actually, with this kind of more theoretical categories thinking, to thank you and to end this wonderful conversation and this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I want to know if I can save these questions.
We really thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great questions and great interest. So I'm really happy about this.